My name is EJ Milner-Gulland. I'm Tasso Leventis Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Oxford. Welcome to my exp. I guess the main conservation challenges are trying to avoid the threats that we have all around the world. And it's interesting that you can see different changes in species loss in different parts of the world, but the threats are pretty consistent across the whole world. And about 50% of species that are under threat because of various kinds of land conversion. Then it's about a quarter over-exploitation. And a lot of that is kind of trees and fish as well, not just the things you would typically think of as conservation dependent. And then there's other things like invasive species and pollution. Interestingly, climate change is only like 5 to 10% of threatened species are threatened by climate change at the moment, but obviously that one's going to continue. Remember, humans have been living with the nature of our planet ever since we were part of the planet. And so, we've always been converting our planet and using the species. And I guess early on, we did have kind of fairly substantial impacts locally, but it's only really in the last, 50 years that we've been able to really convert the planet on a massive scale globally. So, if you put it into historical context, you can see evidence of hunting, you can see evidence of land use change right the way through the planet. And of course, much of Europe, we need to remember, was converted centuries ago. And so what we're living in already is a very human modified area. And so the areas where we're now concerned about conservation are areas where perhaps, the conversion has been lighter touch up until now, and now we're complaining in Europe, having already converted our landscape centuries ago. Climate change, of course, is going to be a huge issue, but much of the issue from climate change is exacerbating the threats that are already there. And currently, although it's changing fast, this assessment, but currently the kind of most urgent threats to species and to habitats are not about climate change, they're about our actual use of land. This land conversion does mainly mean the end of the wild, and the kind of shifting of the wild into what we see in Europe actually, which is some semi-wild, but mostly pretty domesticated agricultural landscapes. And those agricultural landscapes are not without value. We have biodiversity in our agricultural landscapes, but they are dual purpose landscapes. And maybe one of the things we need to think about as we move forward is how do we have more biodiversity rich dual landscapes where people and nature are coexisting. I think there's a real tension within conservation about, do we go the way of separating humans from nature? So do we hold on to the wild that we still have? Some of those unconverted areas or lightly converted areas where there is still nature, and then separate out the humans so that we intensify the areas that we have and grow our food there. That's one way of thinking about it. The other alternative way of thinking about it is, do we have multifunctional landscapes in which humans, wildlife, natural and converted landscapes can be more integrated? And I guess and this may be because I come from Europe, I'm more for that second path, because I think humans without nature is a sterile existence. And again, that might just be my personal bias, but I think there's quite a lot of evidence now that people need wild places, people need nature in order to have good well-being. And that includes within the cities. So we need to think about, how do we green our cities and how do we live alongside and with nature? That doesn't mean that we don't have wild spaces, which are those last close to pristine areas, but we need to think about how we live alongside nature as well. What will come in the future is not going to be the same as what was in the past. And in order to move forward, we have to recognise that. We have to think about the precious species, ecosystems, interactions, processes that we want to conserve, but we need to think about them in the context of the new ecosystems that we're going to have through climate change, through new species that are coming in. And I would also say that not all new species that come into areas are invasive in the sense of being damaging. Some species happily coexist with other species, and we need to think about also potentially, as climate change kicks in, we're going to have colonizations of species shifting their ranges. That's going to change our ecosystems, and that is not necessarily something which is going to be negative. It'll just be different. And maybe just thinking once more about that, just one more point, which is that we often kind of put values on things as conservationists, but also as the general public. We think of biodiversity as having some kind of moral value or some kind of, moral value. And I think that is our own projection onto biodiversity. Biodiversity just is, nature just is, ecological processes are. And so when we value some species over others, we need to remember that's our construction. It's not how nature actually works.